Anton Krieger here. This episode of All Things Green is brought to you by NextGen Clean Energy Solutions, your sustainability easy button from concept to completion. Welcome to All Things Green. I'm Anton, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. Chris Maurer is the principal architect of Redhouse Studio Architecture, an architecture firm and humanitarian organization based in Cleveland, Ohio, that concerns themselves with research, equity, and design. Chris, how are we doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on the show. How did you get into sustainability, Chris?
Well, I've worked all over the world, and a lot of my architectural practice happened in Africa, and there was really a focus on leveraging the construction process to make impact and leveraging limited resources to make buildings. So, sustainability was almost a mindset there, and then I guess I would also say biomimicry is another concept that really factors into my experience in sustainability, noting that nature makes no waste, and it has this ability to convert waste into useful things.
So your background is in architecture. You went to Kent State here locally.
That's right.
And how did you learn about biomimicry? What is biomimicry?
Well, I've always been interested in biomimicry even before architecture school, but it really was a useful tool, I think, in architecture. It continues to be a very useful tool in any kind of engineering or practice where you need to solve complex problems, because that's what nature does. And biomimicry, easily stated, is just learning from nature, looking to nature to see how nature solves problems, and kind of building off of that, 3+ billion years of tinkering that of evolution that's kind of led to these solutions that are extremely complex and not necessarily thought through, but useful in combining complex processes together.
And through some of your work, you are mastering the art of myco-architecture. Can you tell me a little bit some of your projects and what myco-architecture is?
Sure, yeah. So starting with myco-architecture, defining that's actually using fungi to shape the built environment. And the reason, it has that prefix myco comes from mycology, and with the root word of being fungus. So myco means fungus, and ology is obviously the study of fungi. And so with mycotecture, you're actually able to use living organisms to grow materials or actually shape the built environment. And it's a really interesting concept that I learned about mostly from manufacturers that were making materials for styrofoam replacement, packaging materials.
Wow.
And some, there were some artists that were doing some really interesting work actually sculpting out of these materials. And I, immediately wanted to take that to the scale of architecture and see if we can, make buildings out of these materials.
So how do you go about this? Brass tacks. Do you get a mold, you get your mushroom, and you get your substrate, and you just grow it into this mold, or how does it work?
Yeah, that's absolutely one way to do it. Is you can kind of use mycelium, which is you might think of that as the root structure of mushrooms, but the better way to think about that is it's actually the organism of the fungus, and then the mushroom is the fruit. So that's the mycelium is actually able to grow in like a 3-dimensional matrix that can combine any kind of substrate, and it's usually going to be an organic substrate that's a waste material of some sort. Mushroom cultivators use straw or sawdust from mills that are the industrial waste. And so you can actually grow the materials, but we think that you could leverage more of that process, and so we've developed some processes where In Africa, for instance, we have a startup called Mycology that is taking encroacher bush, which is causing desertification, uses that as the substrate. We chip that up into small bits. We grow the mycelium on that, which produces mushrooms. Again, that's the fruiting body of the fungal organisms. And then those mushrooms become food to feed people. And then we take that waste material that's a mixture of the bush and the fungal mycelium, which are, again, kind of the roots of the whole system, and we compact those into huge blocks that then we use for building humanitarian housing. So we get a whole bunch of benefits in this process. One, the encroacher bush, we can regenerate grasslands by thinning the bush, and then we grow food, which obviously is great. We can feed people with that. And then the building materials are not only very sustainable because we're using a waste resource, but they store carbon dioxide. They take that CO2 that the bush has drawn down during its life cycle and store it away for a very long time.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, we talk about circular economy on the podcast all the time, and it sounds pretty much like you got it down pat.
Well, yeah, we've worked on it a little bit, and all credit goes to the fungi in this case because the very circular organisms, right? They're famous for taking dead matter and converting that into useful things, whether that be mushrooms for eating or soil for growing more food. So yeah, the fungi are great at that, and again, that's learning from nature, right? We take that process of recycling and converting and use that in an architectural method.
We had Eva on the podcast from the Laurel schools quite a few episodes ago. She worked a little bit with you on bioremediation. Can you tell me about that project that you worked on with her?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's great working with Eva and the others at Laurel School. They have an environmental justice semester where a really fantastic program. All of the girls in the program go to a house in the woods, and they contemplate environmental justice and work with volunteers like myself and some others that are looking at promoting environmental justice. And the work that we did with those is based off our biocycler project. So whereas Mycohab takes bush and converts that into food and housing, the biocycler actually looks at taking abandoned homes, which we have a whole lot of here in Cleveland, and recycling and remediating that material into new materials. So we're not making food and materials with this one. We're making materials and remediative services. It comes out of that. And the studies that we're doing with remediation, we're working with folks at Case Western Reserve University, Johns Hopkins, and others, where we're looking at, firstly, the easier thing is breaking down petrochemicals that are in the built environment. That's things like bitumen and asphalt. That's easy to do because those are hydrocarbons that are ancient. They're made from oil, which was made from trees and dinosaurs and things like that existed a long time ago. It's actually bio-based when you think about it. And the fungi are actually able to break down those long molecule chains into very, shorter molecule chains that are then safe. The more pervasive contaminant that's in the built environment are heavy metals, and that includes lead, especially that's in lead-based paint that's been used up until nearly the 1980s, that exist in the crumbling infrastructure here in Cleveland. We have a very big problem with it. 4 times the incidences of the national average here in Cleveland, and so that's one of the things we're looking to tackle, and we're working with these researchers to find ways to firstly filter that out. You can't break down heavy metals the same way you can break down petrochemicals because they are elemental toxins rather than molecular toxins. And so you have to, filter that out, sequester that somehow, or finally, if there are some of these heavy metals that are left over in the material, even parts per million or parts per billion, there's no amount of safe lead in the built environment. What we do with that is the fungi are actually able to create these chemicals that chelate the heavy metals. And if you ever known anybody that's had lead poisoning, they might have gone through chelation therapy, which they ingest a chemical that binds with the lead that's in their bloodstream and enables them to pass that through their urinary system. And so that's what we're looking at doing with these biological functions is actually to pre-chelate that so that if there is any heavy metals left in the material, then it becomes biologically unavailable. It becomes neutralized in something that can't affect a living organism, and that's not just people. That's like vermin and insects that then go up the food chain somehow. The spider eats the fly, and the all the way up the song,
Yes,
right? You know what I'm talking about?
I know the song.
Yeah, so that's the concept there, and yeah, Eva and the girls at Laurel, along with their mentor Angela Yeager, were working with us with researchers at Case Western Reserve University, where we said, okay, we're doing this, we're studying this in the built environment, recycling houses. We should look at soil as well. And so we've looked at soil, and the mycelium that we use to sequester and chelate these materials, we're able to filter out 90% of the lead that was in the soil sample within 5 days. And we believe we can get that to 100%. We've started, tracking around 30-40% with this biocycling process, and we're up to 90% now. And our goal is to filter and neutralize 100% of the lead. That's not only useful in the built environment, but it becomes useful for remediating things that eventually go to landfill. Because right now, all of this toxic waste is just going to landfill, percolating back into the water supply and still poisoning us. Eventually, we're just kicking that can down the road, and poisoning the soil, poisoning the water supply, and poisoning the earth because it was put into the built environment on purpose for some reason.
Right. But it's so amazing that fungi can bioremediate things like heavy metals, petrochemicals. For my own work, I'm kind of curious. My organization, Buckeye Environmental Network, studies the application of a radioactive de-icer on the roadways and how that builds up in the soils. Can mushrooms process things like radiation?
Absolutely, yeah. So,
wow.
Yeah, the further you go down this rabbit hole, the more you'll learn that anything you don't like, they probably do.
Okay.
There's researchers that have trained them to digest cigarette butts and things like that. But yeah, when it comes to radiation, that's a really interesting topic. Because there are types of fungi, usually melanin-rich fungi, that are able to transduce ionizing radiation. This is things like X-rays and gamma rays, stuff that would kill you or I, or at least give us cancer. They are able to thrive in those environments, and researchers found this by a specific type of fungus that was proliferating around Chernobyl after the fallout. They took this fungus into the laboratory and then, introduced it to a radiation source and saw this growing towards the radiation source and, named that radiotropism. When something grows towards something, it's tropic. So it was growing to this radiation source. Further tests actually show that these organisms not only appreciate that, but they can thrive on this, and they can convert that ionizing radiation into benign forms of energy, things like heat or infrared energy. So there's
Amazing.
this transduction that happens there, and I usually liken that to photosynthesis, where plants are able to take sunlight and convert that into biomass through the form of sugars. The fungi are actually able to take this ionizing radiation, things like X-rays, gamma rays, and even particle radiation, and convert that into biomass with a process called radiosynthesis. So it's very much like photosynthesis, but it's high energy radiation, very dangerous radiation. And so we're working with NASA right now to grow buildings off planet, which was firstly useful for the fact that we can take a little bit of biology, and then once we get to destination, like the moon or Mars, we can pair that with water that we get at destination, which provides 90% of the mass we need for making these materials. So that was hugely beneficial because that can save trillions of dollars if you take a few grams of material, convert that into billions of tons of material.
Yeah.
Then you've saved a lot of money. But then the more we looked into it, this radiation attenuating ability of the fungi actually becomes the biggest asset we have here, because that is the showstopper for NASA for sending people back to the moon. The only reason that we haven't stayed on the moon or sent people back to the moon is because of the radiation problem. Apollo missions put people on the moon for a few days at a time, and that's because the moon can be shielded by the Earth's magnetic shield for a short amount of time as it's coming around the backside from the sun.
Wow.
If it gets to the other side when it gets to the other side of the Earth, it's bombarded by lots of particle radiation, in the form of solar wind. That's just shooting protons and different kinds of subatomic particles that would, almost certainly cause cancer in somebody that stayed there more than a few days.
Yeah.
And so that's the big problem. So radiation shields becomes a huge necessity for NASA, and being able to grow that at destination is a huge opportunity. And we've had a lot of testing done on this too at Brookhaven National Labs, where they can simulate this galactic cosmic radiation, as they call it, and the solar wind, the proton particles being accelerated at nearly the speed of light. And the materials that we've made, within 8 centimeters of that, we can block over 99% of that, the particle radiation that simulates emission. So that's a very small shield. Just as comparison, regolith, or the dirt on the moon or Mars, you would need about 300 centimeters of that. That's 3 meters. That's 10 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 8 centimeters, a few inches, compare that to 10 feet of regolith. So it's a really impressive shield.
I'm just dumbfounded that we're talking right now on the podcast about taking mushrooms or mycelium to like Mars or the moon and growing like livable colonies.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like science fiction to me.
Radioactive alien fungus, what could go wrong?
Yeah. But like you mentioned, this is going to save trillions of dollars for NASA if they're able to take just a little bit of material and upscale it.
That's right. Yeah. So we just 2 days ago, this is being taped in the end of June. 2 days ago, we just were awarded a phase 3 through the NIAC program, which is NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts. This is kind of like a game-changing technology program. And this is, if I'm not mistaken, only the third time they've ever announced a Phase 3 award. So normally, Phase 1s are pretty tough to get, 2s are very hard to get, and then the Phase 3s are, again, very, very challenging. So NASA is betting pretty big on this, and we're working with really fantastic researchers on this. Dr. Lynn Rothschild is our principal investigator. She's a astrobiologist at NASA Ames, senior researcher there. Jim Head, who is a geologist or planetary scientist, as a professor at Brown. He actually trained a lot of the Apollo astronauts to do the geological work and bring lunar samples back to Earth. And we actually have co-written some papers with some of the Apollo astronauts, including Dave Scott, who is the commander of Apollo 15. Everyone's really excited about this possibility of growing buildings off planet, and we couldn't be more excited to be a part of it.
That's just amazing. I feel like we should spend a whole nother episode talking about just the mushrooms on space growing buildings. But I want to get to one more of your projects before we run too thin on time, and that is the Unearthing project. Can you tell me a little bit about your Unearthing project?
Sure, yeah, and this kind of goes to that formative of experience as working in Africa. And so we had several projects when I lived and worked in Malawi and in Rwanda, where we took, with limited resources there, we were able to convert the earth literally below our feet into the building materials. And so there are a lot of processes that are known to many builders, including compressed stabilized earth block, or CSEBs for short, and rammed earth construction, which are very useful for just taking soil and converting that to a building material. So with CSEBs, what you do is you kind of mix the right amount of soil components, including clay, and silt and sand and a little bit of gravel, and that all gets mixed at the right moisture content. Sometimes a stabilizer is added, like lime or even cement can be used to bind that together, but it's compacted at the right moisture content, and then once it's dried, it becomes a very, very strong material. Same with rammed earth. What you usually do is create a formwork, and then you can either physically pound that into the formwork using the same mixture, or there are mechanical methods of doing that depending on how that is. So it's a very great process because especially in that part of the world, in Africa, where you have moderate temperatures, not huge swings throughout the year, but you have a switch, a diurnal switch or a day to night switch of being very warm in the afternoon and cool at night. Because with this material, you get very thick walls, and it has what's called thermal mass. And that thermal mass is able to stay cool in the daytime as it absorbs the heat from the sun. So the interior environment's very cool in the day, and the outside warms up. And then eventually, as it gets through the building, it's nighttime, and now what you're getting is the heat radiating into the building as the air is cool outside. So you're basically heating at night and cooling in the daytime. So opposite of what's happening outside. It makes perfect sense when you come to a climate like ours, where we have days where we need it 70 degrees inside and it's negative 20 outside. That becomes much more challenging because there's not a lot of insulation that happens there. It's more that thermal lag process that makes it very useful.
But what I love about this unearthing project that you're working on is it's kind of like the NASA project where you're using materials on site. You're not having to use fossil fuels and money to truck a bunch of lumber and bricks somewhere to build structures. You're using what's on site.
Yep.
And I'm curious, what is the life cycle of these structures? What kind of elements can they stand up to?
Yeah, so with the rammed earth construction, you'll get normal erosion that happens with that, assuming that you don't put some kind of siding on that. So the siding can always protect your building. That could be metal siding, different types of even wood or fiber cement board siding. Then forever, basically as long as the building stands up, that. But normally what happens is it's a very thick material, and you get normal weathering that happens there. So after 50 to 100 years, if you lose 1 inch out of 18 inches, you still have a pretty damn thick wall.
Yeah.
The similar thing with the mycomaterials. So these are materials that are completely compostable at the end of their life cycle. So if you were to break them up into small bits and bury them in the ground, they would decompose. But if you protect them from the elements, for instance, using siding, or what we've done with Mycohab is like a mud plaster that's put on the outside of that, it theoretically can last forever because it's very similar to wood construction. I live in a house that's wood framed. It's over 100 years old. There are trusses and cathedrals in Europe that are hundreds of years old, and there are even wood timbers that are inside pyramids that are millennia old. So as long as you protect these biogenic materials like wood or the mycomaterials from the elements, they can last forever. But at the end of their life cycle, they can break down and actually turn back into soil, which is, I think, a huge advantage of that. Whereas a lot of the inorganics, they kind of are mixed with chemicals that are not so great for the earth, and then when they become landfill, they end up poisoning the earth and the water supply.
Yeah. What I think is beautiful about what you're doing is you are learning from nature, right? Biomimicry. And you are, in some ways, developing something that's very cutting edge, but it's also something that's very old. And I'm kind of curious, have you seen an appropriate amount of buy-in from other industries or government programs into what you're working on? Or do you think that you'll see more buy-in after maybe some of these projects you're working on really stand the test of time?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. We got to prove it, right? It's good to talk about that. People are starting to think I'm less and less crazy as we're doing this. So we've built the world's first structural building in Africa with Mycohab. There's a reason why we're starting with organizations like that. That was a project that was based off of working with MIT. And Standard Bank was the main funder of that. That's the biggest bank in Africa. They wanted to look at sustainable housing for the millions of people in Africa that are in informal settlements. So they funded MIT. MIT hired Redhouse, and we've been working together on this project ever since to promote something that's pretty futuristic at this point, but starting to come to pass. Similar with NASA, obviously they're very forward thinking. So there's these organizations that are willing to bet on a future technology. When it comes to market adoption, people want to see that it has worked before. They don't want to be the first ones to try something, understandably so. I don't necessarily want to be the first person in a house that hasn't been, tested yet. So that's why we test with these organizations like MIT and NASA, and then we bring them to different markets. And of course, we're have to start pretty small with what we're doing. Things like furniture and maybe interior environments before we go to full structures. But we're pretty close to actually being able to recycle an entire house. And since this episode is going to come out in July, they can look for Biocycler in Cleveland. There's a project that we're going to start soon that hasn't been announced yet, but you'll see that we're starting on a process to actually recycle a home here in Cleveland. It's firstly going to be done as an artistic installation. Whereas we're not going to make a new structure out of the old structure, but what we're going to do is recycle it back into the earth in a very responsible way. We're going to take this house. It's going to be ground into small bits of material. We're going to grow mycelium on that. We're going to create a sculpture that's kind of derived from public input. We're going to work with the neighbors that are in this area and find out exactly what they want. Is it going to be kind of a playground? Is it going to be a sculpture? But we have some ideas what it's going to look like, and then that is going to earth cycle. It's going to basically be able to break down into something that's more plant-based over time, because we'll seed that with different plant seeds, and so it'll go from being a house to being a sculpture to being a landscape art form that people are able to kind of experience. And we'll have the whole thing kind of time-lapse, so you'll see this thing happen, and we call this like the choreography of earth cycling. This material. So it's taking a house and putting it back to the earth responsibly.
How cool. And that's happening right here in Cleveland.
That's going to happen here in Cleveland. Stay tuned.
Absolutely amazing. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you back and hear more about your projects and how they're progressing. Is there anybody else you'd like to shout out on this podcast?
Yeah. So a lot of these projects we're working with, especially with Biocycler, we're teamed up with environmental justice advocates here, including the Black Environmental Leaders Association, Collective Citizens Organized Against Lead, which is CCOL, and MyConnect is a company in that network that is looking at fighting food apartheid and creating food sovereignty here in Cleveland. So, the ability to make food and to make environmental justice is really big in what we're doing, and to have these partners is just really phenomenal.
Chris, thank you so much for all your good work, and thank you for joining me on the podcast. I'm going to go let our viewers know how they can stay in touch with us.
Good, thanks.
If you'd like to stay connected with the show, be sure to follow us on TikTok at ATG Show. And if you'd like to rewatch full episodes, check out our YouTube channel, All Things Green Show. You can find all of our sources from today's episode in our show notes. All Things Green will be back soon. Thank you so much for being a part of the global sustainability movement.